Good afternoon, everyone. We are delighted that so many of you have registered, and I believe this is testimony to your desire to achieve net zero emissions. My name is Kala Nesaretnam, and I'm co-founder of Climate Governance Malaysia, or CGM for short. Our mission at CGM is to influence directors of boards of public listed companies to address climate change and reduce their carbon footprint. The 2021 World Economic Forum's Global Risk Report highlighted that infectious diseases, the failure to address climate change, and biodiversity loss rank among the top 5 risks for businesses in the next 10 years in terms of likelihood and impact. It cannot have escaped anyone's notice, not even the most determined ostriches in our midst, that climate change continues to escalate. We have just witnessed a heat wave that struck the Pacific Northwest of America, killing more than 800 people with temperatures that reached 49.6 degrees centigrade, 11 degrees above the previous all-time high. Sea temperatures are rising, causing more severe hurricanes and typhoons every year. The increased temperature is also causing Antarctic and Arctic ice melts, which is raising global sea level. In 2050, it is projected that the area around Port Klang will be below sea level, and some of us may have waterfront homes. IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, warned that to avoid the catastrophic impacts of climate change, greenhouse gas emissions must halve by 2030 and drop to net zero by 2050. Corporations are responsible for generating most of the emissions and therefore have the responsibility to fix it. Ultimately, we would like to address the current climate emergency and keeping temperature rise to no more than 1.5 degrees centigrade. Ladies and gentlemen, we need to address climate change like we are doing the COVID pandemic, where everyone is worried about it, from the man on the street to medical scientists. And amidst extreme hardship, policy errors, squabbling, and finger pointing, what stands out is the extraordinary ability that most ordinary people have shown to pull together and radically change their behavior when faced with an alternative that does not bear thinking. We need the same commitment for climate change. The threat posed by climate change will not take a backseat to even surviving a global pandemic. The plans to rebuild after the pandemic must include a clear roadmap to net zero by 2050, no compromises. Fortunately, we have a growing number of policy and business leaders who agree. In responding to this situation, various corporations have declared net zero emissions by 2050. While this is an example of good corporate citizenry, it also makes economic sense. A report by Standard Chartered Bank just last month said that Malaysia-based suppliers risk 269 billion ringgit by not going green. Both investors and regulators have been increasingly turning their attention to how leadership in the boardroom could serve as a powerful agent for change in the way that companies reimagine their business in a net zero world. Ladies and gentlemen, it is expected that the momentum for getting to net zero emissions by 2050 or even sooner will gain momentum after the United Nations Conference on Climate Change, known as COP26, is held in Glasgow in November this year. Based on climate ambition targets submitted by governments worldwide, including Malaysia, we will know whether we are on target or not to the detriment of our present and future generations. In Malaysia, we have yet to set a net zero target, but it is heartening that the Prime Minister and his cabinet colleagues have started the ball rolling with the launch of My Climate Action Council. A number of priorities have been announced, including the implementation of the Low Carbon Mobility Development Blueprint and a possible carbon tax. Bursa, Securities Commission, and Bank Negara Malaysia under JC3 are also studying ways to encourage climate governance from the finance and investment angles and to enhance climate risk disclosures. As you would like to play your role in addressing climate change and getting to net zero emissions, this webinar aims to provide clarity on how to get there and the benefits in doing so, including managing risk and attracting greater investments. So I'm delighted that at this practical webinar we have Mr. Faroze Nadar, the Executive Director of UN Global Compact, Malaysia and Brunei, Mr. Alizan Mahadi, the Senior Director, Research at ISIS, and Ms. Ching from the Malaysian Plastic Manufacturers Association. For an issue as critical as this, the board must play its rightful part in fully understanding and driving the company's climate transition strategy. It must bring informed external perspectives, constructive challenge, rigorous oversight, but equally strong support when boldness and risk-taking are needed to steer a company through short-term pressures and keep an eye firmly focused on the long term. Let me now conclude on a positive note. Malaysia was net zero as recently as 2004, so we can achieve this again. We should also not forget that we were net zero because we had forests and biodiversity that acted as carbon sinks to offset our increasing GHG emissions. Unfortunately, this is fast changing. So whilst we look at reducing our emissions, we also need to look at how we can protect and restore our natural habitats. We can do it sooner if there is a whole of government and society approach, just like the pandemic. Let us all work together in saving our planet as we don't have a planet B. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It now gives me great pleasure to invite Tunku Dr. Alina Alias, founding member of CGM, to moderate this webinar. Alina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Kala, for the powerful reminder as to why climate change issues are so urgent and must be prioritized by all of society. And thank you everyone for listening in on our panel today. So I'd like to begin by asking why you have chosen to invest this next hour to hear people talk about net zero. So we'd love to hear from you, and Matt or Sunita will set up the poll now. Sunita, if you could. Lovely. So while you're filling out that poll and we await the outcome, let me continue. So I'd like to frame our hour today by differentiating net zero from zero carbon. Now, zero carbon is when no carbon is emitted in the first place. For example, if sourced from on-site solar PV facilities only, as opposed to purchasing electricity that's coal-based. On the other hand, net zero refers to a state whereby your GHG emissions is balanced by your GHG sequestrations or offsets. To know whether one has achieved this state, one has to know the total GHG emissions from your business, calculated according to the GHG protocol. So we're talking about scope 1, which is emissions produced by your own activities. Scope 2, which is fossil fuel-based purchased electricity. And scope 1 and scope 2 usually is not not a problem for most. Then there's scope 3, which is emissions in your value chain, upstream and perhaps downstream, up to certain limits. So most times, other people's scope 1 and scope 2 is your scope 3, essentially. So assuming your organization is ready to go on a net zero journey, I would propose that it begins the journey of 1,000 miles with a first step. Make a statement of intent or a pledge. An example is the Race to Zero campaign by the UNFCCC. It does not mean zero carbon, but it means net zero. What follows is a hierarchy of intervention priorities that companies and businesses would adopt in achieving carbon neutrality in operations and products. So first, you look at abatement. Then it's followed by reduction of emissions. Thereafter, you look at substitution, for example, by renewable energy. Next is sequestration and removal of carbon. Then only would you look at offsets, and only once you have exhausted all the other interventions. Finally, and this is subject to technology, is capture and repurposing of carbon. We are here to find out how we can undertake any of these responses and what the levers or enablers are to help businesses do this. Here we go. Here is the poll results. Fantastic. Most would like to know more about net zero, and we'd also like to know how to engage with policymakers and see where the opportunities are. Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sunita. Okay, so today we have with us 3 panelists. One, an expert in policymaking in sustainability. The second, a leader in inspiring businesses to align with SDGs, in this case, SDG 13, and giving them the toolkits. And the third, a practitioner of the circular economy. So you must be wondering how 3 apparently different perspectives could possibly converge on this topic. So I will invite each of them to tell you how. This will be followed by a Q&A session. So I'm looking at probably about 1:35. We'll do this. Please type your questions in the chat box. Kala will curate them for us. We are rather time constrained, so we'll try to respond to all unanswered questions in our website after this event. Thus, esteemed panelists, can I invite you to tell us in turn about your work and its role in the GHG emissions arena here in Malaysia? And Alizan, can I invite you to kick off our panel discussion today? Thank you.
Thank you, Alina. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good afternoon. First of all, thanks to Climate Governance Malaysia, CGM, for inviting me today. So my intervention will focus mainly on the issue of policy and governance, I must add. Because when we talk about governance now, we don't only talk about government, we don't only talk about national governments, but when we address an issue like climate change, we have to also address international governance, governance in other countries, as well as even private governance. So today, focus of my presentation will be mainly on, firstly focusing on the national and domestic policies, but also I will include 2 other levels, which are the international policies and also private governance. I think Alina already set the scene very well in terms of understanding what we mean by net zero emissions. But whether it be for a country or a company is very important, because no 2 net zero emission strategy are created equal. You see, again, it depends on the scope, 1, 2, or 3. It depends on whether we are talking about carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emissions. Greenhouse gas emissions includes non-carbon dioxide emissions. For example, agricultural companies may want to include methane and so on. What is the timeline? I think I'm sure many of you followed a recent report produced by Petronas, estimated about 2065 for Malaysia to achieve net zero emissions. And also, what are the specific sectors of whether, the portion of whether we reduce the carbon emissions or whether we offset those emissions. So these are, whether for a country or company, it's very important for us to determine this. Okay, so first I'll speak a bit about my main focus, which are the national policies and governance. So I think first of all, I'll speak this across what we call the policy cycle. I'll talk a bit about policy targets. I'll talk a bit about also the policy formulation process, as well as the policy implementation. So in terms of policy targets, I think Dr. Kala already mentioned, in terms of net zero, currently we do not have any target in Malaysia to achieve net zero emissions. Also, when we talk about net zero emissions, this is known as long-term climate ambition. At this moment, we do not have any net zero climate ambition for this moment. However, I think Dr. Kala also mentioned that we are in the process of preparing for COP26 at the end of this year, which will be held in Glasgow, and Malaysia is in the process of updating its nationally determined contributions, which also will include a roadmap for achieving this NDC, and therefore watch this space very carefully, and also play a role in influencing this process, because this is where we can plausibly see our targets being updated, as well as specific mechanisms to achieve those targets. So at this moment, in terms of policy targets, what we do have is the overall aim and pledge to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions intensity of GDP by 45% by 2030 relative to emissions intensity of GDP in 2005. This consists of 35% on an unconditional basis and a further 10% conditional upon receipt of climate finance, technology transfer, and capacity building from developed countries. But as I highlighted, this may change even by the end of this year. So in terms of the policies, generally speaking, in terms of the policies and the policy formulation, in terms of climate change related policy, I think there is a bit of a misconception sometimes that we do not have many policies related to climate change. Actually, we have a range of policies related to climate change. And here I must also remind, when we talk about climate change, there is climate change mitigation and there's climate change adaptation as well. Mitigation addresses issues of reducing carbon emission production, while adaptation focuses on adapting to climate change, such as flood protection and ensuring our food production systems are resilient. So here I can just highlight a few of them in the constraint of time. In terms of the overarching policy, we have the National Policy on Climate Change. This was introduced in 2009. There is no explicit target for this National Policy on Climate Change, but the aim of it is really mainly to mainstream climate change across all policies, as well as to have an integrated response to climate change. So at this moment in time, in 2009, there wasn't an explicit policy attached to it. But as you can imagine, this will be revised as we go along forward. But beyond that, we also have at the planning process, we have our Malaysia plans, our 5-yearly Malaysia plans. And here we have already incorporated climate change within these 5-year development plans. And this is, of course, very important because the Malaysia plans is the starting point for resource mobilization for government as a whole. So in the 10th Malaysia Plan, there's a focus on climate resilient growth strategy. In the 11th Malaysia Plan, there's also a focus on strengthening resilience against climate change and natural disasters. Also in terms of planning, there's also spatial planning. For example, the 3rd National Physical Plan, which also focuses on climate change resilience. So this is mainly for climate change adaptation. So in terms of other sectoral policies, it includes Green Technology Master Plan, National Transport Policy, National Automotive Policy, Roadmap towards Zero Single-Use Plastics, National Cleanliness Policies, National Red Plus Strategy, Biofuel Policy, and so on. So there's a lot of policies that have relevance to climate change. And therefore, the challenge, I would say, in the context of Malaysia is not the lack of the policy formulation itself, but we all know the key challenge is actually policy implementation. And when we talk about policy implementation, firstly, this is based on the policy instruments. In terms of policy instruments, academically, we say there's hard instruments and there's more soft instruments, if you like. The hard instruments are regulatory mechanisms, so a legal act and so on. So at this moment, we do not have a Climate Change Act. This is currently being considered. but we have more kind of soft instruments. Soft instruments, for example, action plans, guiding documents, and so on. So here there's quite a few. Once again, there's the Low Carbon Cities Master Plan, there's the Transport Master Plan, and so on. And this gives guidance in terms of implementation. But we also have something, I would say, kind of in between. These are more market-based instruments, and these provide incentives for climate action. This includes things like net energy metering. We have the National Energy Efficiency Action Plan, which provides incentives, for example, providing grants for undertaking energy audits and so on. We have the Green Technology Financing Scheme, and so on. In the interest of time, I don't have time to go into detail, but what the major point here is that first of all, in terms of the policy instruments, there's no hard instrument in terms of legal requirement, and there's also not a broad-based instrument that provides a disincentive, for example, a carbon tax. These are more broad-based instruments, but these are instruments that are currently being studied by the government, as also mentioned by Dr. Kala earlier. Also, in terms of the policy implementation, we have to understand the process of policy implementation, and this is where it is very complex. As you can see, this is what I term, there's horizontal complexity and vertical complexity. As you can see from the various sectoral policies, climate change really cuts across various sectors. And in this sense, it's very challenging when we talk about implementation. Within the process, although climate change cuts across various sectors, the overall climate change policy is formulated within one ministry. And this is the Ministry of CASA, Environment and Water. Previously it was MESTEC, KETA, NRE, and so on. But the other sectoral responses will also have to be coordinated with an overarching policy. So this is a major challenge in the context of Malaysia, the horizontal complexity. Added to that, there's a vertical complexity in the context of Malaysia, where all these policies have to be cascaded down to the state level and down to the local level. And especially if we talk about climate change adaptation, this is a major challenge in terms of spatial planning and so on. So as an outcome, how effective has policy been in Malaysia? I think, to be fair, it is still a relatively new area. But on the other hand, we have seen our carbon emissions still rise. Implementation is still a challenge due to the reasons that I've highlighted. And this has resulted in challenges specifically, I would believe, for companies and so on. Just as an example, when we talk about mitigation in particular, 80% of emissions we all know come from the energy sector, both from energy production and transport. And many companies will rely on the national grid for their energy. And this requires national policies because not all companies and firms can generate their own energy. So as a consequence, many industries and firms rely on national policies, on the energy grid, for example, for renewable energy rather than generating their own energy. And this requires strong political will and a push from stakeholders and their own industries if we want to really move towards net zero. So just to complete the segment on the national policies, I think basically at this moment, Malaysia is somewhere in the middle. If we take the two ends of policy formulation, one in terms of the targets, we do have targets, though we are in the process of establishing more longer-term climate action targets. We still are also in the process at the other end of the scale, looking into policy implementation, looking at specific instruments, looking at the Climate Change Act, looking into disincentives like carbon tax. So I think moving forward, this is something where it will evolve as we go along. Okay, secondly, in terms of when we talk about policies and governance, we also have to look into international policy and governance. Here, as highlighted before, if we look at our policy targets, they are all related to the international process at the UNFCCC. We had, firstly, our first target for climate change was reducing 40% carbon emission intensity, which was set in 2009 at COP15 in Copenhagen. Then we updated that in Paris, 45 to 35% within our national determined contributions. and we will update hopefully this year in Glasgow later this year. So these targets are not really Putrajaya-centric in many ways. They are more derived within the international processes. So it's very important for businesses to also follow the international process and influence this international process domestically as well through the processes at CASA. Also, when we talk about internationally, it's very important to survey the international landscape, including the policies of our trading partners themselves. The EU, for example, has proposed a carbon tax on products, goods, and services exported to the bloc. And while some may argue that this may create a trade barrier, these are called carbon adjustment border mechanisms. This does demonstrate the need for firms and businesses to be aware of policies and market-based instruments that are enforced not just in Malaysia, but also beyond our shores. There's even more radical proposals, such as by Nobel laureate economist William Nordhaus, who advocates establishing a climate club among countries which adopt harmonized emission reductions, such as through setting carbon prices and carbon tax, and penalizing non-participants through imposing a tariff on all imports. While I do think this is unlikely to materialize because this is against WTO rules, however, there is this trend where countries will be judged by being kind of so-called part of the club that are ambitious for climate action and outside the club, which is not ambitious, and this may, moving ahead in the future, directly affect trade. Okay, finally, just briefly, I'll also touch on private governance because I think we all can see we are, this webinar itself is organized by CGM, and we have seen more and more private governance taking a key role in terms of climate action. And this can take many forms. This includes shareholder activism, supply chain management and policies, investor and ESG compliance, or even generally consumer demand. And there's a strong global momentum towards this internationally in particular. I think from all of you will know from the compliance for investors, Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, the world's biggest asset manager, recently warned that companies without a clear plan to address transition to net zero emissions will see their valuations suffer. But now at this moment, I think there's still a space for better understanding in merging between private governance and public governance and the ambitions of climate action. So I think this is really an opportune time as we head to the run-up to COP26, where we have the right balance between the ambition that is set by the national government at the national and international levels with the feasibility and the ambition set by the private sector moving forward. So as a conclusion, I hope some of few takeaways that I have highlighted within my intervention is, firstly, there's a real need to understand what are these transition risks. As we have seen, there's a range of sectoral policies. There will be even many more as we go along, because climate change is becoming a policy priority as we move forward. And this is gaining momentum both nationally and internationally, and it's only pointing one way. So businesses and firms need to understand these policy changes in a broad and nuanced manner that is essential for the business operations itself. Secondly, in terms of policies, at the moment, policies are less focused on concrete targets, or so-called hard mechanisms. And while broad-based and hard mechanisms such as the Climate Change Act or a carbon tax is not yet implemented, this will be possibly implemented in the future. And in my opinion, if this is implemented, these more broad-based mechanisms, it would lead to better implementation, which we are seeing the lack of now. And thirdly, business, market forces, and private governance play a really key role in not just climate action as a whole, but also influencing public policy. So if Malaysia wants to be in this so-called club and ensure our companies are resilient against trade barriers on the one hand, and also generally be a force for good, businesses will need to engage with government and promote climate action rather than resist climate action as a signal to the world. And driven by the international processes such as COP26, this is a good opportunity for businesses to engage government and influence the direction in terms and the ambition for climate action. With that, thank you, Alina. I end my intervention. I look forward for any questions later.
Alizan, thank you so much. As I said before, you're a dream moderators, panelists. You summed it up for me perfectly. But the takeaway for me is that policy is not a one-way street. And definitely, you know, industry should and ought to engage, particularly pertaining to sectoral policies, isn't it? Because only the players will know what actually will affect them. And you pointed out the transition risk to all of us, essentially, perfectly. So thank you so much, Alizan. I'd like to move on to our next panelist, Faroze. And Faroze, please share with us your work. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. Let me just share my screen. So I have some PowerPoints to share. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Elena. Firstly, thank you to Climate Governance Malaysia for inviting me to share my topics, share my insights on today's webinar. It's always an honor to share the seat with Alizan and CY as well. So my intervention is primarily going to look at setting science-based targets as one component towards helping to accelerate and achieve net zero ambitions. So what is science-based targets? So science-based targets is actually an initiative that is developed by 4 founding partners. UNGC is part of it, also with CDP, the world's largest environment initiative, WRI, and also one of the world's largest NGOs, WWF. The idea is, how can we create an initiative that sets targets that is based on scientific methodologies for private sector, that has its own boundaries and time-based approaches. And it's currently being used by many companies. And one of the benefits that are being seen by companies is both internal and external. There are a lot of benefits in terms of external facing that companies are used to setting science-based targets, are seeing brand positivity. They are seeing sustainable finance investor engage them more positively. But I think so importantly, it drives internal innovation, because now you've got a target and you want to see how to achieve the target. And from a governance perspective, it makes you more future-proof in terms of the transitional risk that's happening from a climate perspective. In an interesting paper by CDP, it shows that for companies in the Asia Pac, transitional risk towards climate is even more pertinent than the physical risk. And if you're closer to home, if you look at the latest reiteration of the Malaysian Code of Corporate Governance, it clearly highlights that setting a science-based emission target to support cleaner and sustainable growth is one of the best practice that is recommended. So it will help to future-proof in terms of regulation aspects as well. Just a snapshot of companies who are setting science-based targets. So now there's about 1,600 companies globally. In Malaysia, it's still a relatively small number, but we are seeing more and more interest of companies who are engaging more with us to understand better, because they want to go down this pathway. So Sarawak Energy is the first large corporate to do this. In fact, we already have a company, Ramatex, who has a verified target. Regionally, global region leaders like CP Group, CapitaLand, globally companies like Amazon, BMW, and Nike. In fact, Nike is interesting. They actually make it mandatory for their suppliers to set science-based target if they want to continue to sell to them. In terms of governments, is science-based target a standard? It's definitely not a standard. It's one of the many approaches that's being done. But there are some national governments who are advocating this. So for example, the UK government is mentioning that you've got to have companies with strong climate credentials, which is evidence-based on science-based targets. The Japanese government actually incentivized companies to set SBTIs. In fact, they are targeting 100 Japanese companies to get on board. So that's why there's a large number of Japanese companies, second only to the Americans. But also there is a growing number of Indian companies on board. And we hope to see more ASEAN companies to come on this journey as well. So what is the SBTIs? SBTIs is derived from the whole Paris Agreement discussion, which is built for governments and global economies. So the idea is, how do we translate what happens from a Paris Agreement approach towards how private sector can plug in at a methodological approach that also will see how they contribute towards the NDCs, and more importantly, the carbon budget that is being set. So it covers the various boundaries and scope within the company's value chain, scope 1, 2, and 3. It has a time frame, 5 to 15 years, and is expressed in matrices that are relevant for various sector and companies. So it is science-based target because it's based on the various science-led initiatives like the IPCCA, IEA, also private sector focused documents like TCFD. So that's why it's called science-based targets. And in a snapshot, basically what it means is that companies, as Alina very eloquently put it in her opening remarks, needs to reduce before they talk about offsetting and things like that. So how do companies reduce emission within their own operations from scope 1, scope 2, and also importantly, scope 3, in terms of targets that's aligned to the Paris Accord. So just to summarize, science-based targets, they provides a clear defined pathway for companies to reduce their GHG emissions. It also helps to make you future-proof, because we want to it's to ensure that we are reaching the temperature that we need to reach based on the Paris Accord, and they are in line with the latest climate science. And I'll show you an example how it's in line. And the idea is to limit the global warming to well below 2 degrees, and to pursue the holy grail of 1.5 degrees. And why is this different from other climate sustainability targets? So the science-based targets, we like to say it's based on climate science and projections, and it looks at the emissions budget. So therefore, it's in line with the Paris Agreement. Targets are led by science, and I think this is the most important bit. It advocates doing what is necessary, not what is easy or convenient. So that's a quick intro to what SBTi is. How do we set a target? There are two approaches for large companies and SMEs. So again, we also understand that SMEs are a big actor in the space. We also need to onboard them. So we've kind of simplified the process for SMEs. But for large companies, there's a standard approach. There is a process to this. So you basically commit to the SBTIs, you develop your SBTI plans, you submit it to SBTIs for verification, and then you start communicating your progress and you disclose your achievements. So between the day you commit, you're given 24 months or 2 years to produce your plan and get it verified by SBT. So when you are a committer, you're shown as a committer, and then after you're verified, you're shown as a company with validated targets, and that's why you need to start communicating how are you meeting the targets that you set in place. So effectively, you can choose several pathways to commit towards the SBTs. It's either a well below 2 degree scenario or a 1.5 degree scenario. And I'll share a bit more about this. So this, I would believe, is one of the more important slides when you talk about SBTIs, right? So the idea here is that how do we set the science-based targets? The good thing about SBTs is that it's kind of pre-calculated for organizations, for companies, because we are looking at the budget. So we could pre-calculate what companies need to set in them wanting to meet the different pathways that you choose. So you're given originally 3 options, but because in the latest climate science, 2 degrees is no longer acceptable. So that is actually scraped off. So now you're only provided two pathways. You either be a company that contributes towards a well below 2 degrees or a 1.5 degree pathway. And the idea being here is that how do you calculate what we call your linear annual reduction rates, or rather how much you have to reduce in terms of your emissions from scope 1, scope 2, and also in a certain context, scope 3, year on year, for you to be a company that's meeting this pathway. So you need to establish a baseline year, and from that baseline year, you set your time-bound targets from 5 to 15 years, and a pre-calculation of a minimum amount of reduction that you've got to go through. So for example, if you're a company that wants to say that we are a company that contributes to a well below 2 degree scenario, we need to reduce our absolute carbon emissions by 12.5% in 5 years, and up to 37.5% if you're taking a 15-year target. There's also the intensity approach. This is looking at your output. That's a different calculation. And then we also have sectorial decarbonization approaches, which looks at different sectors and the kind of targets that you can set. So there's a whole suite of tools and guidance that is provided by SBTs, which is cross-industry, which you can take to apply in terms of how you establish your targets as well. There's also a lot of interactive, what they call this, Excel sheets that you can plug in some numbers, and it gives you certain projections of what kind of targets that you need to look at, and what kind of reduction numbers. So again, just to summarize, as I mentioned earlier, for corporates, you only can pick 2 pathways, a 1.5 degree or well below 2 degrees. But because we understand scope 3 is a challenging aspect of any corporates, there is a little bit of leeway that is provided here. There are some options that you can choose. For example, you can actually look at a 2-degree scenario for your scope 3, and the condition is that if your scope 3 is for your total emission as result as part of scope 3 is more than 40%, then scope 3 becomes a material boundary for you. If it's not, you may decide to discount it from your SBT targetings as well. So it's also pragmatic in a sense. We want to ensure that everybody, it's real and people can get on board, and it's not necessarily overburdening to achieve the SBT targets. I want to share this interesting research that was done very recently by Science Based Target. So because the SBTs is a calculation methodology, and if you have baseline numbers, you can actually calculate what is your temperature. So this is a research that is done by SBTs looking at the G7 stock exchanges, and really how aligned are we to meet as businesses to meet the Paris Accord, right? So usually we are saying, well, are NDCs enough? I think now we also got to ask ourselves, as corporates, as businesses, are we doing enough to ensure that we meet this well below 2-degree pathway? And unfortunately, the reality at this point of time is not enough from the G7 countries. What more from a Bursa perspective? So this calculation gives you a methodology that is easily justifiable, and with the new changes of TCFD demand, and also the evolution of the, for example, indexes like FTSE, which will take into more TCFD recommendations, and you have to start setting these targets around carbon reduction. The SBT gives you a good template and a good, compass for you to justify why should you set this kind of reduction numbers, and what are the initiatives you got to take to meet those targets. So just like how we go to shopping, and we got to scan our foreheads. In the future, it's most likely that because these tools were able to calculate your temperature, we are actually predicting that in the mid to longer term, financial institutions would also be asking questions of what is your corporate temperature before they start factoring your risk into lending and things like that. And if we look at the engine number 1 case with Exxon, I think it's also demonstrated that why climate governance becomes much more important moving forward as well. So I'd just like to end with a call to action. We would like to invite everybody here to be part of this our UNGC's business ambition for 1.5 degrees. This is the most ambitious program that we have for climate action. So this is basically saying that you should ensure your company is a 1.5 degree pathway company. Net zero is a longer stretch goal as part, and 1.5 is a pathway for you to achieve this net zero. And this is an official part of the UNFCCC program as well. And I also like to end by sharing a resource, a public resource that UNGC has. This is an interactive 30-minute e-learning, kind of like a SBTI 101, which answers a lot of interesting questions. I would also like to invite and encourage everyone on this call to on your free time, please have a visit and learn more about the SBTI initiative. With that, Adina, thank you very much.
Thank you, Faroze. Leave that last slide on so that people could copy down the information. Thanks, Faroze. I was an art student. So when you talk about science, I get all glazed. But you've given me some reassurance because it's methodical. I mean, it makes sense. It's methodical. And what you are actually saying is that this is a best effort initiative. Companies can sign on and then get hand-holding or coaching from UN Global Compact to help them map out the road. And it is a gradual process, isn't it? It's a year-by-year reduction. Because if you look at the overall, from year 1 to year 15, you have to reduce by 45%. That just boggles the mind. Yeah. But if you're looking at it on a yearly basis, this year is 1.7, next year is 1.7, it's achievable. Yeah. I think it's very helpful. The methodology that you've laid out, of course, you know, the reasoning, the rationale behind it for companies is definitely unassailable. You know, your brand premium and your access to finance and investors, your governance being future-proofed, and so on and so forth. What is also assuring us that last research that you shared with us, there is no major G7 stock indexes, despite all the efforts thus far, that they have not yet aligned to Paris 2015. So what more the rest of the world? But I think the message, what's important is that going forwards, everyone, not just the banks, everyone, your customers, your supply chain, your employees, they will be asking, what is your corporate temperature? So yes, thank you so much for your message. I've really learned a lot, Faroze. Thank you. Now, I'd like to invite Miss CYW.
Yes.
CY, why don't you take the floor and share with us how a practitioner approaches this net zero conundrum?
Thank you, Alina. Let me share my screen. Right. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So I'm CYV and I chair the Sustainable Subcommittee of the Malaysian Plastics Manufacturer Association, better known as MPMA. Established in 1967, MPMA represents the voice of 750 plastics manufacturers, which accounts for 80% of Malaysia's total production of plastic products. As a progressive trade association, MPMA leads the plastic industries in government liaison, strategic alliance, trainings, skills upgrade, and most importantly, for the last 20 years, we have been actively promoting sustainability practices and the proper use of plastics with due care to the environment and the community. Today, I would like to share with you what circular economy is and how plastics will go into a sustainable industry through a circular economy. The concept of sustainability affects all sectors of the economy. This table I extracted from Bloomberg New Energy Finance gives an overview of the transition each major sector of the economy will potentially go through towards net zero target. The transition will be supported by science and cross-cutting technologies. Plastics being fossil-based chemical product will transit through the circular economy for a more sustainable future. So what is circular economy? Circular economy is a revolutionary transformation from a make, use, dispose to a make, use, return society. It is based on this concept that Ellen MacArthur Foundation initiated the new plastics economy in 2016 as the catalyst of change and created a common vision within the plastic sector. The circular economy for plastics means simultaneously keeping the value of plastics within the economy without leakage into the natural environment, changing the linear plastic systems to a circular one through fundamental redesign, fundamental change in how we produce our goods with innovation so that plastics can be reused or recycled. So how does circular economy apply to the plastics industries? In a circular economy, plastics will not end up in the landfill like you see on the picture on the left. Plastics post-consumer will be separated and collected for recycling, which in turn reduces plastic leakage into the environment. Clean and well-separated plastics can be mechanically and chemically recycled and used to produce valuable plastics product again. The addition of recycled plastics into the production of new plastics product will reduce the demand for virgin plastics raw material, which then translates to reduce of demand for fresh fossil fuel. So the world over, countries are focusing efforts to increase the collection of plastics and setting ambitious plastics recycling targets of more than 40% by 2030. Malaysian government is spearheading multi-stakeholders engagement to design policies and set targets for the local plastics industries. There are 4 targets so far. Malaysia plans to eliminate 5 problematic plastics by 2025. By 2030, all plastics packaging being produced has to be recyclable, reusable, or compostable. By 2025, 25% of post-consumer packaging should be effectively recycled or composted. Last but not least, by 2030, all plastics packaging will contain an average of 15% recycled plastics. So how does the industry, the plastic industries, work towards circular economy? So this circular economy for plastics require all stakeholders in the value chain to collaborate and move in tandem, starting from the resin for producers, for example. You will see investments in chemical recycling to process difficult to recycle post-consumer waste and turning them into its original state of fuel, and using this circularly regenerated oil to produce plastic resins again. This is decoupling our dependency on finite fossil fuel. The second one will be the converters or the manufacturers of plastics products. We work together towards the 2030 Malaysian goal or the brand owner's goal of producing plastics that are 100% recyclable, reusable, or compostable. And as more plastic products are collected for recycling, the Malaysian recycling industries will invest in advanced recycling technology to improve recycling capacity and capability. Last but not least, the brand owners. The brand owners will continue to shape their brand sustainability. And in fact, they are the one who is going to spearhead demand for sustainable material. We already have the top 10 brand owners in Malaysia coming together voluntarily to set up a Malaysian Recycling Alliance, better known as MARIA, to look into ways to increase collection of plastic waste through a voluntary extended producers responsibility scheme. And over all this, our government is drafting the roadmap for the circular economy for plastics to ensure smooth transition of the plastics industry into the new plastics economy where no plastics will ever go to waste. So we can expect lots of reimaginations, lots of shift in mind and in the way we do business, in the whole in the whole plastics business and its supply chain. For example, novel sustainable packaging concepts will mushroom. New business models to increase collection will take off with the introduction of extended producers' responsibility scheme, and more low carbon delivery and logistics will be introduced. Because being sustainable in the plastics industry is more than being just circular. It involves looking into the life cycle and reducing our production carbon footprint too. With this, thank you very much for your attention and your interest. And I hope I have enlightened you with the future of plastics and its sustainability. So please feel free to contact MPMA if you wish to know more. Thank you very much. Back to you, Alina.
CY, thank you so much for sharing with us your experience on this. I have so many questions pertaining to the circular economy. This is one of the items that's mentioned, or that one of the key decisions included at my CAC in April. But of course, you know, as with everything, we have some wonderful ideas, some brilliant ideas, but you can't quite imagine how it translates. Particularly in our country. So, you know, you've used some fantastic words during your talk. Revolutionary transformation, where make use, instead of make use, lose or dispose, it's make use and return. And the idea is that you would keep plastics, or if it's a different industry, whatever material that's used as feedstock, you would keep it within a loop or a circular system without leakage into the natural systems. So I think when we talk about circular economy, there's many different business models that you could use, I expect. So one is that you've described is more like a technical loop. The natural cycles would occur in agriculture, for example, where, you know, they've been doing it for thousands of years. So in a way, that's biomimicry, where you're adopting the ways of agriculture into industry. But I think what message I'm getting from you particularly is that a fundamental change in mindset is required for this, right? Because you need to be creative. You need to reimagine the future. And what you have demonstrated is that it is possible. It is possible. Now, what I'd like to ask, and what I'm hearing from all three, so this is going to be a question that's open to each of you. What I'm hearing from each of you is that the writing is on the wall. Within the next 10 to 15 years, might be even sooner, there'll be massive changes in policies and laws coming. And if companies and businesses don't want to look at it and try to avoid it or pretend it's not coming, then we are not doing our jobs as directors if we were directors. So, but however, I have a sense that there are some barriers that my company might be facing. From your perspective, what are the barriers? What are the key challenges faced by businesses who wish to move to net zero by 2050? So why don't I reverse? Let's invite CY to tell me or share with us what your thoughts are on this.
Well, thank you, Alina. As in any new businesses or new business model, there's always resistance. Today, we are just talking about the environment. Maybe 10, 20 years ago, I remember in the factories, we have introduction of ISO system. So there were also a lot of resistance, and we are feeling resistant because we don't know. Yeah. So with more information, and for example, this platform, disseminating the information and enabling the players to come together and discuss, I think it will only make people understand better. And when you understand better, you you think that you have a way to do it. I mean, the resistance is just because we have so many things in our mind and we don't know where to start. Yeah. So I think it takes time. And I think more important is that the business recognize it's always changing. Yeah. Like they say, change is the only thing constant. And you have to adapt, right? So yeah, I'm sure a business that has survived, they have gone through many cycles of change. And this is just one of them. Yeah.
Thanks. Just jump in, Faroze, Alizan, whoever's ready.
Right. I definitely echo CY's comment. I think one of the issue is perhaps, when you talk about net zero science-based target, it can be intimidating, right? So understanding that, I think first is that one of the challenges is that how do you translate this to a more understood language across the organization? I think that is one of the challenge. And then also the other thing is that 2050 is in our minds is actually very far away. So how do you also translate this to more short-term and mid-term targets that is relevant for a business perspective? And I think this is where I suppose it's not so much of a mindset change, but a little bit of leadership in a sense that perhaps we should not always just ask is it profitable to us? Is it? But perhaps we translate the question towards is this going to support us as an investment, or will it actually drive a purpose for our business? I think that's the leadership needs to come into that kind of questioning as well. So I think those are the kind of challenges I believe companies are facing from a climate perspective. But it's going to change. The externalities are going to sink in, right? In our conversations with MNCs, at the end of the day, they're talking about low carbon sourcing. That means it's going to go to their supply chains, and the pressure is going to push down forward. So if you're not ready for this, you're just going to be left out, and you will actually, instead of today we're asking it's expensive for us to transform, but in the future you're not even a viable business, and that's even more expensive to you. So it will come on this.
Okay, if I may add, Alina, I think I completely agree with both speakers and with CY on the resistance. Essentially, we are locked in into certain practices, and what we are talking about is a transition. It's a bit of a cliche, but what this calls is for change. And change, as many of you know, is very difficult when we have been locked in into certain practices. And specifically from the policy side, I've already painted a picture. For example, institutionally, we are locked into how we have been organized even from our constitution. Some powers are allocated or under the jurisdiction of the state level. We are locked into certain decisions we've made in the past, for example, subsidies for fossil fuels to power our economy. And it is very difficult to change these policies. And of course, it will, there will be a lot of resistance from various stakeholders in addressing this change. So again, I think I completely agree. We are locked in many of these practices, but it requires quite significant action, quite strong action from the policy perspective. As I mentioned, at the moment, my view is we have a lot of policies, as I highlighted, but a lot of those policies are not really broad-based. So it needs a strong signal from the policy target perspective, and it needs strong signal from the policy instrument perspective, whether that be, like such example, an act or a broad-based mechanism such as carbon tax. Thank you.
Thanks, Alizan. I like the term you use, locked in. I was reading a book on cults and how the followers of Trump were, how do I describe it? As if they were following a cult leader. And the psychology behind cults. And one way was how to get people into the cult is by unfreezing them and freezing them back. So my question is, how do we get unfrozen out of this locked-in state? Oh, I see Kala there. I know we have tons of questions, Kala. So I can't even let you all answer this question. Okay, but that was just a whim of mine. Kala, over to you.
Thanks, Alina. And as usual, Alina, we have loads of questions, and I don't think we're going to do justice. But let me assure all the audience that questions that have not been answered by the panelists today will definitely be posted onto the website by tomorrow. So with that, let me start the Q&A, and I'll go according to the presentation. So Alizan, the first question to you, it's from Marina Yong, and Marina is stating here that there's a serious lack of policy coherence to climate change. And Alizan, in your opinion, who should lead this process of policy coherence so that there is coordinated policies rather than policies that are developed in silos and therefore difficult to implement? Can the recently established MyCAC do this, or should it be a ministry? So I think basically, your magic wand, Alizan.
Thank you. Certainly the $1 million question, or what was it, Dr. Kala? $260 billion question or something.
Yes.
Yes, okay, we can see this in two ways. I've highlighted quite a few of that in my presentation and in my answer just now. We can look at it from an institutional perspective or from a mechanism perspective. Okay, institutionally, yes, it has to be right at the top. So MyCAC does give a very good platform because it's chaired by the Prime Minister, and this has to be driven by the Prime Minister. And on top of that, MyCAC, the innovative part of MyCAC is also that it includes chief ministers as well. So that was the kind of innovation where I mentioned vertical complexity, where the intention there is to cascade down. But the reality of climate change, again, not just in Malaysia, in any other country as well, is it is extremely complex, and institutionally alone will not solve the problem. Of course, in general, it's a shared, it requires shared action and so on. But the biggest hope, I think, comes from very stringent action and mechanisms, which I mentioned, such as a carbon tax or a climate change act, which defines from a legal perspective how what actions do companies, do individuals even have to take. So these are broad-based action. But I have to warn, of course, these broad-based actions will not be popular. We have seen the reaction from GST, for example, and that arguably contributed to a loss in terms of the elections, amongst other things. So a carbon tax in that sense alone will not be popular move, especially from a political perspective. But we have to look at it from a holistic perspective. One thing that we haven't really discussed in Malaysia, for example, when we talk about the transition, is a just transition. You see, many countries when they strategize or draft their pathways, they include, for example, compensation for the dirtiest forms, in fact, of fossil fuels, etc. So there needs to be a shift in terms of how we look into the pathway towards whether that be net zero or any other target, and we begin to compensate and be fair in terms of that transition and ensure that, as far as possible, it's not winners or losers situation, but it's a case of so-called losers. We have to compensate, retrain, reskill, or something along those lines in developing the pathway. So again, the devil is in the detail. There needs to be a holistic solution, and there needs to be a clear pathway towards any target that we aim to achieve.
Thank you very much, Alizan. The next question is going out to you, Faroze. And it's from David Tay, and he thinks that, sustainability is a very expensive exercise, especially since, we've got so many sectors, palm oil, manufacturing, etc., etc. So the question is, how are we going to reduce our GHGs and achieve net zero when significant investments are required in alternative energy and business operations? Faroze.
Thank you, Dr. Kala. I also want to echo Alizan's word about that shift, right? I think sustainability now needs to shift to be more broad-based in its output. I think for too long it's been too tunnel vision, that it's sustainability is a domain of environment and one or two people in the organization. I think it has to move beyond that. And the reason for doing sustainability is for it to be more competitive and more resilient. And I think this is proven in the MCO era. If you look at the sustainability indexes, it's shown that sustainable ranked companies outperform their peers during these issues. And that's because sustainability has made them more agile, more efficient, and things like that. And I think that's where sustainability sits in a strategic domain of the business, right? So when we talk about GHG reductions and net zero, ultimately it's a disciplining exercise for the company to be more efficient across board, because now effectively what you're pushing for innovation to do more with less, right? So you are going to actually use less to do more. So you're going to be more resilient when you're faced with this kind of externalities and shocks. But but at the base, when we talk about climate action, for me, it's not about target setting or no process or whatever. It's actually a culture shift. The entire organization needs to see achieving a net zero from a cultural perspective, and they make their decisions based on this, right? That at the end of the day, yes, we need to out-pocket certain things, but it's an investment for us to be more resilient and more competitive moving forward, because this is going to be the license to operate. There's no two ways about it. So again, it's a cultural approach of how we want to put it. So as long as we don't change our culture to see this as an investment, we'll forever see it as a cost, right? So we've got to make that transition. So not just about just transition, but also I think as leadership transition, that this is good for business in the mid to long term. Like it not, this is going to come. So you've got to do it.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, Faroze. And I think companies don't realize that consequences coming their way. And I think Alizan earlier alluded to CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. So I think we better start now, or we're going to get stuck.
So guys, if I just add more, also I think important that we've also got to see these climate initiatives from an efficacy perspective, right? From how ready or how equipped is your organization to do things like this, and take the incremental route, right? Doing the exponential is going to be expensive from the start, but there are a lot of built-up efficiencies you can do. When you plateau, then you talk about your next shift. I think there's also a misleading narrative that may be propagated by consultants that you need to spend a lot of money to do this kind of thing. Actually, I think you can take easy pathways into achieving a net zero as well. Thanks again.
Absolutely. Thanks, Faroze. So the next question is to CY. CY, this is coming from Dr. Gary Teixeira. He would like you to explain the fact that one of the most frequently found litter in water bodies is actually the most recyclable, which is your PET bottles. So he says, what is in your view the most effective means of fixing this? CY?
Thank you. And thank you, Gary, for the question. The most effective way actually is to make sure that when we dispose our plastic waste, that we do our separation at waste, that we collect back instead of dispose it through our normal waste channel. So the problem with Malaysia is that we have a policy that we need to do separation at source at home and at work, but it is not implemented, and many of us don't do that, right? So, and when you don't do that, you throw your organic waste and your valuable plastic waste like PET together into your waste stream, and it goes to the landfill. So maybe this is a good time for me to also say my call of action to everyone here today is to start practicing separation at source. You have to collect, you have to separate your recyclables, be it metal, paper, or plastics, and separate it from the organics so that the organics will be delivered to the landfill, while the recyclables, although being collected by the same party, because I know some of us would say that, you know, it's very common to see them mixing all up at the end. But, you know, I perfectly know that feeling because I've seen it myself. But it is a step. It's a chicken and egg thing, right? In Malaysia, it's a chicken and egg. So we do our part first. We do our waste separation. And then we will, I mean, we will talk about the second and the third method. Yeah, many of us have no chance to look at the material recovery facility near the landfills where all our waste will be sent and collected. You know, in that center, there will be another sortation. So don't be angry if you look at them collecting together, because at the end, it will be sorted. I really believe so. Of course, there are some foreigners who do some tailgate sorting. So whether that's illegal, illegal, it doesn't matter, but it will not get to the landfill. I really think so, because although we don't know, but they are quite well versed with what can generate some small incomes for them. Thank you.
Thank you, CY. This is a personal plea. If CGM, for example, was to initiate a drive, say, you know, in my residential area to collect plastic from my neighborhood, would MPMA be interested in, you know, collecting it from us? I mean, is this something that you would appreciate?
Yes, of course. We have linkages, we have associates, we do, we have contacts with businesses who will collect and then, you know, put it through the proper channel. Yeah, we will be more than happy if you can organize your area, and then, yeah, we will be more than happy to link you with the appropriate collector, you know, so that all the recyclables are being collected and processed properly. Please.
Fantastic. That was really great. Thank you. So the next question, I think, goes out to Alizan. It's from He Jean. I came across carbon credits that can be bought to reduce carbon footprints. It's offered from the UK. Do we have any in Malaysia? How is it actually governed? And how can Malaysian companies contribute on a larger scale on buying carbon credits to make a difference, Alizan?
Okay, thank you. That's a very good question and very specific. I have to give a caveat here. I think this is a question that should be answered by KETSA, the ministry. Of course, this is like many things in climate change, especially climate change policy in Malaysia. It's very dynamic now, so it's moving. But we do have what's called the RED Plus Finance Framework. And what the RED Plus Finance Framework looks at is looking to govern the carbon trading process within Malaysia. It's, you know, when we talk about carbon trading, we talk about two types of markets. One is a compliance market and one is a voluntary market. At this moment in time, as far as I understand, we don't have a compliance market, meaning we don't have a national market which compels you to, for example, trade carbon, or and therefore we have more voluntary markets at this moment in time. This is still being developed as far as I understand it. So I think you would really have to check with KETSA in terms of how we transfer credits from internationally, etc. But what I would suggest is really, I know there's a few instruments called the Forest Conservation Certificate, FCC, and Forest Carbon Offset, which is being developed by KETSA. So I would say from an official process, it would be very important to follow that process rather than a voluntary carbon market internationally, because we're not sure how credible that will be, especially further down the line. It's a bit technical, but this is really it can get really problematic, you see, because when we talk about offsets, when we talk about net zero emissions, if we partake in a voluntary carbon market that is not being calculated or registered within Malaysia, let's say we pay for a certain amount of offset, that means that Malaysia is double counting its offset, you see, when we calculate our GHG inventories. So sorry, it's a bit technical, but my suggestion is really, as far as possible, follow the official process like KETSA through our FCC or FCO, and I think please refer to KETSA for further guidance on this.
Thank you very much, Alizan. I think, Alina, we probably can take just 2 more questions before we wrap up, I think. So this question from Asni Hardiana is going out to you, Faroze. You talked about SMEs, so she's interested in, how will SMEs join this journey? So I think her question is, how does the GHG emissions reduction translate down to SMEs and cottage enterprises? How long will the transition period take place in Malaysia, you think?
Right. In my opinion, from a Malaysian context, this whole SME onboarding towards the climate agenda has to come from a supply chain perspective. It has to be driven by the supply chain owners to onboard their suppliers, and it's also part of your Scope 3 agenda, right? It's unfair that we use the same expectation brush to SMEs, and also unfair to the cottage type industries as well. So we need to clearly demarcate that everyone is a different type of actor and requires different kind of support to ensure that there is this alignment for what they call it, achieving the net zero together. Now, how do we get them on board? I think we need the supply chain owners need to be innovative about the incentives that you've got to put in place for your SME suppliers to come on board. And it may not necessarily have to be financial in nature, right? I think that we are working with several government agencies who want to talk about financial incentives. But what we want to see more and more from the procurement guys is, perhaps a green lane policy, perhaps, what do you call it, a recognized supplier or something, that there's some form of incentive that pushes them up and motivates them to come to this the climate aspect. At the end of the day, in a COVID setup, right, everybody is talking about sustaining, right? What more about sustainability, right? So I think we've got to be pragmatic. It's important that we see entire supply chain, but how do we talk about incentivization for SMEs? I think that becomes a key criteria. I think, and at the end of the day, the accountability of SMEs participation must reside in the owner of the supply chain. If not, means what's going to happen is these big boys will just push that pressure to the small boys. The small boy will push to maybe a smaller boy, and kesian, the smallest guy, don't know what to do. So the accountability has to also come from a supply chain perspective. Then we're also talking about a just and fair expectation and transition across private sector for climate action as well.
Yeah, thanks, Faroze. I think the last question, Siwa, is to you. And I tend to believe, I tend to agree with this gentleman who has posed the question. He's saying that I think we have been very cooperative in reducing plastic waste with single-use plastics ban, etc. But the COVID-19 pandemic reignited demand for single-use plastic bags, plastic packaging, and many other single-use items like masks, gloves, and test kits. And I tend to agree with him. My husband is a Lazada fan, and every time he gets a Lazada, online purchase, it's wrapped in tons of plastic. So the question is, do we have the technology and infrastructure to recycle plastics used for medical reasons, which are considered biohazard? Over to you, CY.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Kala. Now, the biohazards is best to be incinerated because, as it says, it poses a safety issue. So in Malaysia, all biohazards are being incinerated. So to take it one step further, the future will be incineration and capturing the energy. So it's a waste to energy kind of infrastructure. So that will be a transition that we think that will go through. Waste to energy infrastructure is coming up in Malaysia. And then your second question as to you know,
All the
we are all human, and convenience is what makes plastics still available today. Let's put it that way. And it's very difficult. I mean, it's difficult for us to go back to those days anymore. It's difficult, right? Once you are here, you can't see yourself going back. So it's about really very conscious and intelligent use. Malaysian Plastics Manufacturer Association, we always talk about the 3R: reduce, reuse, recycle. So if at all you can control, and if you want to go and get your food, whether you really should consider getting your own container. Yeah, I mean, although we are making plastics, although we love for you to use more, but I think this would help the industry survive, to be honest. By using lesser will actually help this industry to survive. And by reusing, it's even better, right? So, yeah.
Thank you, CY. I think we will, thank you for those practical suggestions. We will send the plastics your way, and we make sure that when we tap our food, we don't take plastic or we don't, get the plastic containers from them. Just last question to you, Siwan, before I hand over to Alina. I think this is just, progressing from what you said about incinerators. So will there be large scale and other incinerators? What about toxic pollutants from that?
Well, that is an administration and how you build and control, an environment. So MPMA has really no, has no control over that. Yeah,
control over that.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think, Alina, we are done with Q&A. We didn't do it justice, as I said, but we will make sure that all questions are answered. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Kala. Okay, so we're coming up to the last 4 minutes of our time together. Sunita or Matt, could you just put up the last poll? And actually, this last poll is just for CGM, just to find out, how we have helped you, if at all, today. While you do that, I'd like to ask our panelists, just in 10 words, what would be your call to action to all of us here?
Well, I would say that be the catalyst of change, help ourselves, help the plastic industries. So do the separation at waste at home and in institutions and in wherever you can have an influence. Please always, please make sure that this is done, because we urgently need all your plastics back. Thank you.
Okay.
Faroze, go ahead.
Sure, yeah. For me, it will be, let's avoid paralysis by analysis, right? I think let's commit and then find a pathway to do it, because we do not have another choice. Throw the ball and chase after it.
Yes, similar to Faroze, strategically speaking, the transition is inevitable. So we have two options. In the race, if the so-called race to zero, we can try to turn it into opportunity and be in front, or we can remain resistant and lag in this race. So I think this is the reality and the options we have.
Thank you all. Thank you so much for your call to action. Very inspiring. Fantastic. We're very pleased that we've been able to help you better your understanding for net zero. So thank you so much. So with that, we have come to the end of our hour together, and it's time to say farewell for now. Thank you for investing your time to learn more about the race to net zero. And we hope that you found the discussions to be beneficial. So part 2 of this webinar series will be held in September, and we hope that you will be joining us then for more levers and enablers to add to your toolkit and for your respective roles. In the meantime, we'd like to wish you stay safe, stay healthy, and stay happy. Panelists, thank you so much again for your contribution. It has been a very, very good experience, learning experience for me. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Alina.
Bye. Thanks,
Thank you,
Kala.
Alizan. Thank you, Faroze. Thank
Thanks,
you, Dr.
Sunita
Kala.
and Matt.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.